I'm the chief architect for DevOps and continuous delivery. I work for Intel IT. I've been a software developer for over 20 years. Now my title is architect, but I still consider myself a software developer. So how I got in this journey is 2 years ago, our team was tasked with just solving the path to production issue. Our path to production was taking an average about 8 weeks. That is code that already complete and having to go through all the various CCB, change control board, permission to be released. So we were told, shrink it down to something less than 8 weeks. So in my research, I came across the book by Jess Humble, Continuous Delivery. You may have heard of it. I read the book cover to cover, and at that time, I was already familiar with continuous integration, test-driven development, and I was an advocate for those. So I felt that, hey, this was, the logical next step. So I basically, convince, cajole, bribe the rest of my team to get on this exciting journey with me to adopt this new practice. So fast forward 2 years later, we have a couple of success under our belt. We have our showcase app. About a year ago, they finally said that, okay, you guys have the official task of figuring out how to bring the rest of the company along. So to give you a sense of what the rest of the company look like, again, I work for Intel IT. We have about 6,000 employees, supporting about 100,000 employees worldwide across 66 countries. The 6,000 number, by the way, doesn't include contingent worker and also a lot of embedded IT. So the actual number is actually much larger. So our challenges, not unlike any big corporation, we have a lot of application already in our environment. We have over 1,300 applications of every imaginable technology stack you can think of, except mainframe. We don't have mainframe, Intel architecture, and IBM doesn't match, but so thankful for that. And we found that in our as analysis, we do have a large workforce, thousands of people to retrain. We have developers who don't have the right skill set. Most of them don't know test-driven development, don't know how to write unit tests or have desire to. You have a lot of testers who don't have the automation testing skill set, and sysadmin who are used to just following the manual, executing things manually. In addition, Intel is also a big adopter of IDLE. I know I've heard conversation rumbling that whether IDLE or DevOps mesh. For us, we finally figured out that sooner we accept that this is not going to change and we just have to deal with it, the happier we'll be. So sharing some of our approaches, our successes, and some approaches are not so successful. The first thing we did, actually, even before we were officially tasked with the role of making this transformation happen for our enterprises, we started a community of practice. So we're hearing a lot of people say, well, what can you do? You're dealing with large enterprises, slow to change, etc. We found out there are a couple of approaches. You don't need permission, you don't need money to do, and one of those was a community of practice. So we started meeting every 2 weeks, just a few of us, and it grew to a couple hundred people. We deep dive in certain topics and tools. We start sharing each other's successes and horror stories. We invited external speakers like Adrian to come in and talk to us and share industry best practices. And we recorded all our sessions and make it available online, so that is cross-geo-friendly. You remember the previous slide, we have employees across 55 different countries, different time zone. So the recording was make it easy and accessible for information to be available for others. As well as we were finding out that we get a lot of replay after the fact, as more and more people start finding out about this community of practice, about the information that are available. They started, also rewatching our old videos. So when we got enough critical mass, enough excited volunteer, we also started having some hackathons. And for us, it was a successful approach in terms of getting people look at and experience our continuous integration, continuous delivery tool stack. And all the output, out of our hackathon and out of our project, we put it in our internal open source. That's another tool that was really helpful for us. So if you don't have one in your company, highly recommend getting some sort of internal open source initiative happen, because it makes the uplift so much lighter if you're spreading the responsibility amongst others. And when we finally got to a point where we have an official program and some money, we started hiring and getting official vendor training in place for people who prefer classroom settings. So another approach we took, actually this is one of the example of things that didn't work so well for us. We should have think about making things easier way earlier. And we should have thought about user experience. But instead, we listened to, or I listened to guru like Jazz Humble, who just said, if you want to get started, don't let tool be, don't be encumbered by tool. Just go ahead and get started. You don't need anything besides a rubber chicken and a bell to do continuous integration. Luckily, we didn't have to use a rubber chicken and a bell. We already have a continuous integration tool in place. But what we don't have is, we figure out that we have 10 other tools all of a sudden that we need to stitch together. Things like, mocking library, dependency injections, our UI testing tools that and we found out that all these tools are owned by different teams. Every tools that we want that are supported, we need to file a ticket, we need to apply for permission, we need to provision the environment, and in some cases, if we want integration in between the tools, we also need to file another ticket, and that's just getting started in our. By the way, that's just getting started. You started in the development environment. If you want to move something to production, that's another set of hurdle to jump through. So basically, what it ended up being, by the time we have 20, 30 other projects on board, we're starting to lose credibility in that, hey, you're touting this DevOps thing that's supposed to make our life easier, right? It's supposed to automate our deployment, one-click deployment. I don't have the work weekend anymore. But instead, I have this overhead of 20 tools that I didn't have before with different escalation paths. So we have to backtrack and go remediate this in terms of, and we found out, making it easy is not so easy because all the tools are owned by different teams and we do have critical gaps. So we're still in the process of stitching all of that together and making it easier for everybody. So this is very much a work in progress. So my recommendation for you, start thinking about scaling if you're thinking about scaling. So one thing that really worked for us is this continuous improvement model that we finally put in place. And how that works is we came up with our own DevOps maturity model. And we looked around, there wasn't a good one for us to adopt. And we didn't feel right. We didn't feel that we have all the answers. But we finally got to a point that it was very difficult to explain DevOps to people. I don't know if any of you have the experience, but explaining DevOps to people is very, very difficult because DevOps is very, very squishy. So we're having conversation that, hey, people tell us, go away, we're already doing DevOps because our developers are already carrying Pager, right? Or, we talk to say, go away, we're using the cloud, so therefore we're already doing DevOps. We finally have to put our foot down and said that if you said you're doing DevOps, these are the 4 things you need to be doing. So number 1, agile. Number 2, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous process improvement. If you're not doing those 4 things, you are not doing DevOps. And out of those 4 categories, we further refined. We broke them into 10 different categories. And for each of those, we identify 5 level 1 through level 5. So that turned out to be a turning point for us to be able to influence. We finally able to have the conversation with teams, especially teams who are like, okay, they come to us, we want to get started. Yeah, we heard all these cool things that you could do, but we don't know where to get started. So this model allows us to first, perform an assets assessment with the team. So, okay, let's figure out where you are right now. And then let's figure out what your next target condition is. Take small baby steps. You don't have to, you don't have to boil the ocean. And so that was a successful approach for us to get teams going in the DevOps journey. Another thing that we found helpful, especially with teams that are, they're coming to us, they say, oh yeah, we want to get started, but we're too intimidated to get started, we don't know where to begin, is the value stream analysis. So this is another tool that we found success with in helping people identify areas, bottleneck, low-hanging fruit that they can automate. Or just improve and streamline the process right away. Now, at the organization level, we knew earlier on that to say, okay, what I just described are things we can do at the team level to help team move down the journey. But at an organization level, how do we influence the change in behavior for the entire organization? Because ultimately, that's what DevOps is about, influencing the culture and behavioral change for the organization. I just recently came across this model. It's this influencer model to help change the behavior for an entire organization. This is something we're experimenting currently. And if any of you heard of this before, welcome feedback. But basically, their model goes something like this, that in order to change the behavior for the organization, you need to obviously first identify measurable results. But more than that, you need to look at what the personal, at an individual level, what are the motivation for change, and does the individual have ability to change, and what can we do, as a central organization to help impact that in a positive direction. So in addition to the personal level, you also look at, the social aspect. Who are the influencer, and are the friends helping the individual, the team level changing? Do they have the ability? And finally, as a structural level, so are your reward system or even down to the room layout supporting the right behavior change? So we can't talk about organization impact without talking about metrics. There's been a couple of sessions that talk about metrics already. But what I will say, the metrics that really resonated with us was differentiating between action and result metric. And I believe this is from the Toyota Kata book. Basically, instead of looking at hundreds and hundreds of metrics and trying to make sense of it, we're trying to differentiate between action metric, which are measures on how well you're doing something, and result metric, which are ultimately the metrics that business care about. And the two are not the same, and you really need to correlate the two to make sure that what you're doing is having the desired impact. Now, we talk about the maturity model. How do we know that we're putting the right thing in the maturity model? We're providing the right guidance. We also, we're putting through the same rigor in that, are we giving the right guidance in the maturity model? Are we setting the right target condition? And how do you measure that, people are doing the right thing? And ultimately, does it lead to the right behavior or the right result? So 2 years into the transformation, how did we do? So to get some sense on how we're doing, one of the indicators we look at is our continuous integration tool. We look at our user accounts. 2 years ago, we have 70 plus people. And over a period, the last 2 years, we got a 10x increase. So now we have over 700 users in our continuous integration tool. So that's the good news. The bad news is, half of the users are inactive. So remember what I said earlier about making the tool easier to use. Our hypothesis is, we can get the rest of the inactive users active again if we make the process easier. So another indicator we look at is how well are the team, of the team that we coach or the team that use the collateral that we made available, how well are they doing in the maturity? And so how do you measure the maturity? So this is a model that we adopted ourselves, we developed ourselves, and our initial take is, okay, well, you can ask people to do as-is assessment and go back and check with them regularly. But then at the same time, we want to see trending analysis over time, and we don't want to keep bugging the team every month and every week on how they're doing. So what we figure out is that, hey, we can infer some of these maturity level from studying what they're doing in a continuous integration tool. So for example, how frequently are they committing the code? How frequently does build happen? Does all the build have tests to trigger? Are they measuring code coverage? So depending on what they're doing, we are assigning, a maturity model automatically. And so what you see the graph, this is the result. So how do we interpret the result? So another thing I mentioned, so we ended up with 5 categories where we determined that these are the things we can really see, from observation in the CI tool. The rest of things like how well are they performing as an agile team is really difficult to observe through a CI, so we threw those out. Now, in terms of interpreting, how well we're doing, across the board, we think that team are making good, say B's and C's progress in the area of continuous integration, continuous delivery, because the area that's associated with those practices, we're seeing, some distribution in the higher maturity and even distribution across. Now, the area that we're not making any impact or hardly any impact is configuration management, infrastructure as code. And that's validated through our observation and conversation and GitHub repository check-in that this codifying infrastructure is still not a common practice across our teams. And so this is an area that's helping guide us that we need to make the investment. Now, a future target for our program, we set ourselves a goal that in 2 to 5 years, we want 100% of the new projects to be using continuous integration, continuous delivery. So, essentially, we want the curve to shift right. So key takeaway from our lessons. So I'm sure you heard a lot of ideas and approaches, from this conference. There are a lot of good content out there, and I've shared some of our approaches. Some may work for you, or they may not. But I think the most important thing that we found that you need to develop a model to figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. For us, our measurement was developing a maturity model, correlating with our action metric, correlating with the result metric. For you, it might be different. But whatever it is, say come up with a model that works for you. Usually that will entail some sort of a measurement, developing, how do you define success, and developing some plan to identify some actions to take. And every investment and every action that you take, because your time is precious, you should measure the impact and know that whether you're making any difference. So one last slide I know Gene asked all of us speakers to provide is wish list, things I need help with. So I mentioned before, better end-to-end integration, that's still a challenge for us. If you have used tools or any methodology or any internally developed tool that work well for you, yes, please share with me. Love to hear about it. Also, what we found out in our testing tool, as much as the test with all the testing tools that are available today, we still find there's some areas that require human judgment. So still need human to review the test result, particularly in the area of UI testing, especially if you need to be testing across different platform, across different form factor, and you need your UI to be pixel perfect. So how do you make the, machine today can't make the judgment whether it looks right. But I think that, this is an area that is achievable with some machine learning. So if you're an open source contributor, your vendor out there, so there's some ideas for additional feature. The other area that we found lacking in our journey is the security scanning tools. There are a lot of security scanning tools, but the area that's lacking is, we haven't found any tool out there that tell us whether we have personally identifiable information in our, in our system, in our application. And unfortunately, that's one area we still asking people to check the checkbox. Do you have personally identifiable information? The other area is also related is what security level, whether we have top secret or restricted secret information that we're storing. Again, that's something that we rely on form and checkbox. And unfortunately, if you know that you're going to have to jump through more hoops, if you check those boxes that said, yes, I have restricted content, then there's incentive to under-report. So this is a real pain for us. So if you know of any tool, again, idea about how you can figure out that kind of information, please share with me. So finally, more tips and collateral on engaging the majority and the laggard. Like I said before, I think we feel like we're beyond the phase of the early adopter, the innovator. Our challenge is engaging the rest of the majority and the laggard, and I think this is the same journey that you're going through as well, engaging the rest of your corporation to come along. So please, continue the conversation in a social media format. I'd love to talk to you and share experiences. And so that's everything I have. I think I have a minute left. If anybody have any questions. Thank you.
Any questions from the audience?
How would you apply this to your microprocessor business in terms of DevOps practices?
It's a challenge. For the hardware side, we do have a lot of firmware and BIOS. There are software. So definitely the DevOps practices apply. But when it comes to hardware, where the constraint is hardware or manufacturing, that's definitely where we're getting pushback. And we also haven't figured out how do you apply that successfully in those settings.
How big's the organization you're moving? You said you went to 800 people are using the tool. What percentage is that? How many people are you trying to reach?
Out of 6,000. But engineers are a smaller percentage, a fraction of those.
So you think you're maybe halfway there, or a third of the way there, or most of the way
Probably
there?
halfway there.
Okay, that's a great move. Any other questions?
So looking back on this process, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently and started sooner or later?
I think one of the things I mentioned is started thinking about making the tool easier to use sooner. We're kind of playing catch up right now, and we felt like we may have lost some of the momentum because we lost some credibility, that people felt they weren't getting the benefit, and instead they were saddling with all these additional tools they have to deal with. So we're playing catch up right now, and we felt that if we started earlier, people would have a better experience, and we would be further along.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks very much, Sherry.
Okay.